Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 33. And today I'm joined by Mike Brind, the author of the upcoming Manning book, Razor Pages in Action. And it's Razor Pages that we'll be chatting about today. So welcome to the show, Mike.
Hi, Dan.
Hi. So when I said upcoming book then, I guess this is actually Manning's MEEP program, which stands for Manning Early Access Program. So it's readable straight away. And according to the website, you're currently 10 out of 14 chapters in. So it sounds like you're getting close.
I've almost finished writing the last chapter. The way that Manning operate their MEEPs is that they'll release chapters on a sort of semi-regular schedule. So that there's 11, 12 and 13 have been written and reviewed. And I guess they'll release those over the sort of next 6 to 8 weeks, a regular interval. And then I'm just looking forward to putting the final full point at the end of chapter 14, so that'll be the end of the book.
Everyone I speak to that's written a book says they didn't appreciate how much work goes into writing a book. Is that something you found?
I'm a little bit stupid in that I did know, because I wrote a book about 10 years ago, but I think 10 years is a long period and you tend to forget.
Is that like having a baby? You forget how bad it is, then you have another one.
I'll ask my wife, but I'm pretty sure that the analogy holds. But I wrote for a different publisher, the first book, and they had a different approach. Manning have a particular, I know that I've listened to the podcast you've done with some of the other authors, and Manning do have a particular way that they want you to write the book. They have a very sort of formidable style guide to get through and so on. And yeah, to me, that's the more difficult part. In terms of actually writing, I'm happy with that. I heard Chris Sainty saying that was the bit he struggled with. And I thought, you poor thing, because that's the bit I find easy. But yes, it is hard work. But it ultimately, it's rewarding. There's stuff I learnt about Razor Pages that I thought I knew and either didn't understand properly. But that's all part of the process as well. You do a lot of research and you have to double check what you're going to write to make sure that you have got it right. So yeah, it's rewarding, but yeah, absolutely, it's hard work. I mean, it's a year of evenings and weekends and early mornings, really. That's basically what it's taken.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what a lot of people say. And you mentioned Chris Sainty. He was saying that he was just getting up really early every morning and that was the time he would do his writing. So Manning have actually very kindly agreed to give a copy away of your book to one of the lucky listeners. And also they've given all of our listeners a coupon code to get 35% discount off any of their books. And that is PodUnhandled21. So any of our listeners can use that to get 35% discount code. And near the end of the episode, we'll be doing a giveaway for a copy of Mike's book. And that's in the ebook format. So before we delve into Razor Pages, could you give our listeners a quick intro into the other stuff that you're working on and your background and what it is you do?
Sure. I'm a latecomer to programming. I spent the first 20 years or so of my working life selling advertising space and managing teams who publish trade and tech magazines. So that's my background. I got involved in programming when I was asked to manage the commercial side of all the fantastic websites that the publishing company were launching back at the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the Inner Geek took over. And that was all around the time of the first .com bubble that burst. And there was some reorganization within the company I worked for. And I started working for a division that did direct marketing for customers. And the first thing they did, which was probably the worst thing from their point of view, is they sent me on a course to learn the basics of development with Access. That's when I realized that databases hooked together with HTML could do something. And so I taught myself classic ASP. So that's where I started. And yeah, I think it took about 2 or 3 years before I became a full-time developer for the company.
I like your phrase, the inner geek took over. That's one thing I love about software development. There's just so much stuff to play with.
Yeah, I think I felt an awful lot more at home with code doing what I wanted it to than people not doing what I wanted them to do when I was trying to sell stuff to them and never really understanding why it is that, my logical pitch wasn't hitting home at all.
Unfortunately, I've found that that problem doesn't go away.
No. I'm a lot more comfortable with why it doesn't work like that. And you tend to think that people are logical, and then eventually the penny drops and you work out that they're not quite often. So that's what I do. I work for a publishing company. I manage the public facing websites, which we've got a range of professional magazines that target a couple of sectors, and a number of internal applications for managing the sort of orders, sales, production of the magazines. And that's it really.
Nice, nice. And you've recovered from using classic SP as well?
I haven't. No, I still occasionally have to look at a classic ASP app, and it's a bit of a jolt when you go back to VB script. But I do have one last outline classic ASP app, which I'm hoping to kill off in the next couple of months and replace it with a .NET. I've just got to persuade the users to move away from it. That's my problem.
So that must feel nice when you jump from doing a bit of that to doing some Razor pages.
The combination of tech I'm working with mainly at the moment is I've got the biggest app is an MVC5 app, but all the new apps currently are being built with Razor pages. That might change. I might be looking at Blazor soon.
Oh, yes. I'm sure we'll talk about that in this episode as well. So before we dig into Razor pages, I'm just going to do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes out to Houston Haynes, who on Twitter said, "Enjoyed an exceptional Unhandled Exception podcast yesterday. Dan and Chris cover a wide range of topics, mass transit, the OSS landscape, and how certain tech is ill-fitted to message queuing." And he's put in brackets Kafka. I'm not sure that's quite what we meant, but never mind. And he also said, "and high-fiving over JetBrains Rider." We definitely did a lot of that. So thank you, Houston. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag #UnhandledException. All feedback is greatly appreciated. And I'm Dracan on Twitter, DRACAN. So Razor pages. So ASP.NET has quite a few different flavors, and I'm thinking MVC, which you've already mentioned, Razor pages, and Blazor, which you've just mentioned as well. So before we dig in and talk about actually building sites with Razor pages, could we start off by talking about when you choose Razor pages over MVC or Blazor?
Yeah, sure. Razor pages, I would use that for any website that you want to build where the HTML is being generated on the server. In fact, I probably wouldn't use MVC for that at all nowadays. The reason for that is one of the reasons why Razor Pages was introduced was it was intended to make developing server-side applications a lot easier than using the traditional MVC framework that Microsoft introduced back in 2008 or 9 or whenever that was. Because one of the things with the MVC pattern or the implementation that Microsoft have put in place with ASP.NET is it uses what I would describe as a front controller approach. Each controller is normally sort of grouped together under an entity such as a product or customer, and they can be responsible for large numbers of endpoints. And so you end up with classes that just grow and grow and grow. And I've got in classic MVC5 applications, I've got controller classes that can exceed sort of 500, 600, 700 lines. I've seen them with more. And as the application grows, so does your controller class. Well, that's not that easy to manage. And you also have to work with the convention of placing your stuff into folders called model, view, and controller. And if you try to fight against that convention, the tooling sort of starts to get a little bit ropey. It doesn't work as well. With difference between that and Razor Pages adopts what I would call a page controller approach to the same MVC pattern, in that your view is still separated from the controller and that's separated from the application model. But because each controller is responsible just for managing the inputs for a particular page, they necessarily are a lot smaller. You get a lot more of them, but they're a lot smaller and they're a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, I found very similar working with Web API. So I do a lot of API work, and having controllers, like you've still got the controllers in Web API. And I find that when you have, especially when doing REST stuff, so you've got get, put, post, delete, and you might be doing dependency injecting lots of things, then it can get, as you say, one controller can get quite big. So I kind of like the mediator pattern where you've actually got a mediator handler, which kind of gets around that. But yeah, totally with you mentioned about the forced folder structure, having explicit models, views, folder, and then controllers. when Chris Enty was on talking about Blazor, he was talking a lot about feature folders. And instead of having these folders that are implementation detail, is it a view, is it a controller, then instead having a directory that says what the feature is. And that sounds kind of like Razor Pages would give you that almost.
It does, absolutely, yeah. And I totally get what Chris was saying. If you try to introduce a features folder into sort of traditional MVC5 app, the first thing you have to do is to fight against the framework so that it knows where to look for the files, because it's trying to look in a views folder. And then when you start to use the scaffolding to create stuff, you get all sorts of issues. It tells you it's already got a views folder, it hasn't got one, and you don't want it in the views folder. But feature folders, yeah, because the routing in Razor Pages is so simple, it's based on file location. You get feature folders just by adding a folder with the feature name on it. It's magic. You don't have to start fighting against any of the routing conventions or anything. It just works.
Yeah, it does seem really nice just having that right at the top. You go to your view and you can see all the information you need at the top of the file, and then you've got your HTML there, and it does seem quite clean. Regarding putting I know this is probably a bit like asking someone whether they like tabs versus spaces, but the whole putting code within the Razor page versus putting code in like a code behind file or the Razor Pages equivalent. Do you find that one's better than the other, or does it depend?
Oh, no, I think I would never suggest anybody puts application code into the Razor file itself. The page model class, the sort of code behind, if you want, is there for a very good reason. In the same way as a controller is in the sort of traditional MVC thing. It helps you to separate your application code from the HTML. I was reading Chris Sainty's book, and he talks about the way he prefers to approach that in components, where he prefers not to use the option to have a code behind for a component, and he'll have his code in a functions block within a component. So his approach with Blazor is completely different to what I would recommend for Razor Pages, which is interesting and something I'm going to explore. Yeah, the page model class in Razor Pages is just like, it's similar to a controller in that it's unit testable, but also you should try to minimize any of the application code. You've got handlers within the page model that respond to the HTTP verbs. So you've got onGet for GET requests, and onPost will handle any processing for a posted. That works by convention. But any sort of complicated business logic should be separated into another layer somewhere. How you do that is really up to you, I guess.
I think it's good to have application business logic separated from the view model logic, I guess. And by view model, I mean code that's very close to what the view is. So if like a button's pressed, then that kind of thing. But yeah, absolutely, I totally agree that I would have any business logic completely separate.
Yeah, the Razor part of the sort of combination, the only logic in there should be to do with presentation and maybe formatting content, looping through collections, outputting it. If you've got anything more complicated, then that should be split out into things which are just as valid for MVC apps as well. So you'll be using tag helpers or separate sort of functions that come. I mean, you could still use HTML helpers if you really wanted to, although tag helpers are preferred now.
Yeah, it'd be good to talk about those in a bit. Just with the whole putting code in, the code behind, in the bits of Blazor I've been doing lately, one issue I hit where I was putting code actually in the component was that for C# code, I actually like 4 spaces for my indentation. And in HTML, I like 2. And it being in the same file with the same file extension, I had the whole, right, okay, so when I format my code, so that was a bit of a pain. So in my mind, for me, that's enough reason to put it in a different file anyway. Sounds a bit silly.
Oh, no, I totally understand that. That resonates with me very well indeed. The other thing I found is that if you're not careful, some of the Razor IntelliSense and formatting can get a little bit ropey as well.
Yeah, I found with maybe not so much now, because I think Blazor is becoming a bit more stable, but in the early days with like the IntelliSense and stuff, whereas some things would throw warnings where it wasn't an error or something. But I think now it's becoming so much more stable, so I'm really, really enjoying working with Blazor.
So are you doing a lot of Blazor stuff then?
Not a lot. I'm kind of like in some projects I'm working on, there's a lot of Blazor upcoming, but I kind of like a lot of my stuff I'm doing at the moment there's lots of API stuff, Kubernetes stuff, as I say, there's Blazor stuff upcoming. For one project, I'm actually playing around with Maui, which is still in preview.
Yeah.
Which, again, just what we've described there, because it's so early days for it, I'm seeing lots of IDE issues where warnings and stuff where it's actually not a warning or IntelliSense not working properly. But it's preview, so I can't really complain too much. It's good that now things are open source and being released early. It's good that we get the opportunity to play with it so early.
Yes, it's a lot different to when I used to be MVP back in the day, when you used to be able to get MVP awards for answering questions in technical forums. But yeah, I remember when the ASP.NET Web Pages framework was launched, and we learnt about that in sort of online meetings that happen once, maybe every sort of 2 months. And we were fed what was being done, and there wasn't a huge amount of sort of encouragement for feedback. Although they like to know what we thought of what they're doing, but there was no sort of input into the direction or anything like that. Interesting how the MVP of programs changed as well with the open source.
Yeah, I think everything's changed. The MVP program's changed. .NET itself has completely changed. It would be interesting to have an episode on Microsoft's journey with taking .NET from being closed source to what it is now, being fully open source and cross-platform and all that kind of thing. It's quite an amazing journey.
Yeah, there are a few characters who are still at Microsoft that will probably be able to talk all the way from the first steps of that particular journey as well. Not many. Most of them seem to have moved on from 10, 12 years ago when it first started.
Well, I'm quite looking forward to Richard Campbell from .NET Rocks. He's been working on a book for quite a while now, actually, but it should be released fairly soon, he says. The history of .NET.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's been interviewing so many people that have been involved in the journey of where .NET started and how it evolved. Yes, I think that'll be a really, really good book when it comes out. Because I don't know whether you listen to .NET Rocks, but like some of his Geek Out episodes where every so often they have an episode where it's off topic from software development and it's just a general tech or science geek out. And Richard does his research. Yeah, he takes a lot of notes and seriously does a lot of research and goes really in depth. So if he's been like that with his book, which I'm sure he has, it should be a really, really good book. So I'm looking forward to that.
No, that sounds really interesting.
So going back to Razor pages, I quite often hear this term Razor components. And I get a bit confused by this because I believe this is actually Blazor components. And whilst it's using the Razor syntax, you can't use them in Razor pages? Or would you still natively default to something like Vue components?
Oh, I think you can certainly embed a Razor component, which is part of the Blazor tech, into a Razor page. And that might be useful where you want to reuse an existing Razor component. But I think from a pure Razor pages point of view, I'd be using a Vue component, certainly.
One thing I like about Blazor is just this concept of using components as building blocks of your website. So in Razor pages, do Vue components fill that same role as you can actually have very small reusable components throughout your application?
Yes, absolutely. Well, there are two different types of ways of segmenting your UI in a Razor pages app. One is to use partial pages, which are still just as valid now as they ever have been. And the other is to use Vue components. You tend to use Vue components for areas of the UI which required some sort of service, like a data-driven menu, for example. You would probably design that as a Vue component and then plug it into your layout rather than going off and fetching the data, because the layout doesn't have a code behind, and you don't really want to be going off and fetching data within a layout page. So yeah, develop it as a Vue components and then plug it into your layout using a tag helper.
So would you still I'm just trying to think of an example. So if you had a nav bar which had a section on social media links, a section with a few menu items, a section with a drop down, a few bits and bobs, I think in Blazor you would make each of those components and make it quite granular and specific. Would you do the same in Razor pages, or is that not really a pattern that you'd follow with Razor pages?
I suppose you could be as granular as you like in a Razor pages app. I mean, you could have the whole thing composed of Vue components and partials if you wanted to. I just wonder about the complexity, and that's one of the things that I sort of look at Blazor and see that the sort of the way things seem to be going is a trend towards more and more componentization. You certainly get that with something like React. So, I guess if you're coming from that sort of working practice, and then Blazor, very componentized, works very well for you. But yeah, I guess I try to minimize the number of files as much as possible because there's less to maintain then. But obviously, you don't want the whole thing in one sort of monolithic page or anything.
Yeah, I guess like everything, there's a bit of a balance though. It's kind of you don't
Yeah,
want to componentize every single line, but you don't want one monolith, as you say.
I guess that the answer is always it depends.
It's a good answer, isn't it? I use that almost on a daily basis, I think.
Yeah. So the people who repair my car.
So it does sound like this Razor Components term is a bit of a misnomer, really, because it is quite confusing. Because if it's a different tech and it's designed for Blazor, I know it's certainly confused me for a while. The ASP.NET Core Razor Components website says Blazor apps are built using Razor Components, informally known as Blazor Components.
I see that Andrew Locke, he's actually written a blog article recommending that you don't go around replacing your Vue components with Razor components, although technically it is possible.
Oh, that's good. I'll include that in the show notes then. I'll have to have a read of that myself. So you mentioned before about tag helpers and HTML helpers. Can we talk a bit about when you'd use those?
Yeah, I'm migrating or sort of been in the process of migrating an MVC5 app across to Razor Pages. And you have to migrate the views, obviously, and each view will be represented as a single page. I'll use HTML helpers in that migration because it's a lot quicker. Although any new applications that I put together, I'll use tag helpers.
Can we talk about what they actually are for the listeners that haven't seen these before?
What the tag helpers you're talking about?
Yes, or both.
Yeah, I mean, the recommendation with .NET Core in the UI is now to use tag helpers rather than HTML helpers. HTML helpers are from the older type of MVC, and there'll be a range of HTML helpers for rendering small parts of UI. So you might get one that renders out an input, a text type input or a text area or a drop-down list. So there's lots of them for form controls, for example, or for anchors. And in .NET Core, they were sort of replaced by tag helpers, which do the same things. But tag helpers use an HTML type of syntax, so they fit more naturally into a view. The attributes on the tag helper activate server-side code. So you can bind form fields, for example, to properties on your view model, which is part of the page model. And the HTML that gets generated will automatically generate the right ID and name attributes on the HTML input types, for example. And it will also bind any values that have been associated to the properties in your page model. So you sort of get a kind of two-way binding, because when the form's submitted and then those values get posted and model binding kicks in, and will bind the submitted values back to the properties on the page model. So one of the other things about the Razor Pages model that I like is that you don't have to sort of create separate view model classes. You still can, but you just add properties, public properties to your page model class, add a bind property attribute to them, and they will automatically get bound during any post request. You can also activate them so they can get bound during GET requests as well. Some people talk about Razor Pages as being an implementation of the MVVM pattern because of this sort of perceived two-way binding between the public properties on your page model and the forms, although it's not probably the same as sort of like the observable MVVM pattern you'll normally sort of see in things like mobile app development or something like Knockout or what have you.
I mentioned Maui before and other things like WPF. The view models there where you have to mess around with the iNotify property change. Oh, it's such a headache. So I'm glad it's not quite like that.
No, it's just it's just a straightforward simplification of the round trip, I guess. That's the way I tend to look at it anyway. But it's not really MVVM at all.
Yeah. I think with the whole, because tag helpers look like elements, then you get this whole reusability and it just fits in nicely with your view. And it's just more consistent for when designers come in and start editing the HTML.
I think that's the key to it as much as anything is a tag helper is a lot more designer friendly than an HTML helper, certainly.
Moving on to a topic that I'm always a big fan of, testing. Are there tools and technologies to specifically test a Razor Pages app, or would you use just the standard Selenium-style website testing tools?
Yes, certainly. For the UX part, you'd use Selenium or Playwright or whatever. You don't need anything special. And because the page model class is separate, you'd submit, XUnit or again, whatever your favorite unit testing framework is. The page model classes support dependency injection in the same way as any sort of MVC controller does. It enables you to separate all your code in the same way as in any MVC app. So yeah, you don't need to have anything special at all really for that.
Cool. You mentioned dependency injection there, which was another thing I was going to ask about. Presumably you can inject dependencies straight into the view itself?
You can, but generally you won't. There are some services that you would inject directly into the view because there's no need to inject them into the page model, only to then use them in the view. One of them, for example, is the anti-forgery service. Razor Pages request verification is enabled by default. You have to opt into it with an MVC app, but it's enabled by default. The form tag helper, one of its jobs is to generate the hidden field for the anti-forgery token. If you haven't got a form or you're not serializing the form in an Ajax post, then you'll need to generate that anti-forgery token yourself, which you can either do by using the old anti-forgery token helper, or you can inject the anti-forgery service into the view, and you use the @inject directive to achieve that, and then you can use the service to generate the token, and then pass that through with your Ajax post.
I see. So if you're doing code behind, you'd use standard dependency injection. If you're in the view, you just do @inject at the top.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's the same @inject that you use in the code behind if you're doing a code behind approach to a Blazor component.
Yeah, it is very nice and clean. Just having that metadata at the top. I think you mentioned the root before as well. Having the root, dependency injection, entries, just all at the top as part of your view. I find that quite clean, actually.
Oh, well, putting the root template at the top of the Razor page. Yes, no, absolutely. Yes, and that same pattern has been taken across to Blazor as well.
Yes, yeah. Very nice. So if you do need to fall back and do some front-end stuff or some client-side stuff using JavaScript, and obviously with Blazor that's less of an issue, but if you're doing it in Razor Pages, are there some helper techniques to allow you to write JavaScript as part of Razor Pages?
You do it in the same way as you would if you were writing an MVC app, really. Yeah, it's no different. It's just JavaScript at the bottom of the file or in separate files and injected. It's essentially the same Razor view engine as you use in old style MVC, let alone ASP.NET Core MVC. So you'll inject it into a section normally called scripts.
So this sounds, you were mentioning before about nowadays you probably wouldn't use MVC and you go straight to Razor Pages. That sounds like it's super simple to take an MVC app and convert it over to Razor Pages.
It is. I wouldn't necessarily recommend migrating an ASP.NET Core MVC app over to Razor Pages. I don't think there's an awful lot to be gained, although your mileage might vary. But certainly for migrating MVC5, sort of full .NET Framework apps across to .NET Core, the migration from the controllers and views to Razor Pages isn't particularly complicated. You'll just find that you're moving your individual action methods across to separate page model classes that support different pages. And the view templates, largely, you'll find that you can move those across as they are. Might need a little bit of tweaking occasionally here and there, but yeah, you could migrate it straight across and then get it up and working. Then your HTML helpers over to tag helpers as you move forward. But any new MVC apps, you can add Razor Pages to those and have a hybrid of MVC and Razor Pages if you wanted to migrate across to Razor Pages over the longer term.
So you can merge both worlds and slowly convert an application over?
You can do, yes, absolutely.
Nice, very nice. So things like authentication and security and that kind of thing, do they just follow the same standard ASP.NET Core patterns, or is there anything different about Razor Pages?
No, it's the same identity framework that you would use in an MVC application. It's not enabled by default. You'll plug it in if you need it. You've got the organizational accounts, the sort of the traditional ASP.NET identity schema and database in the back end, or you can use the same thing to add in third-party authenticators like Facebook and Twitter and Google and what have you. So you don't need to sort of learn anything new in order to be able to add authentication to a Razor Pages app if you're already working with ASP.NET Core and identity in that. And obviously the same is true for data access as well. So looking at Entity Framework, I use Entity Framework and Dapper depending on the requirement for the app. I mean, the magazine applications that I put together are largely read-only. They've got a separate application for managing their content, but that particular set, so I tend to use Dapper because it's obviously quicker.
I quite like nowadays with the Microsoft authentication, it's almost a one-liner with the latest identity libraries. It's quite impressive. We had Christoph Matzkas in one of the earlier episodes, and he was talking about it. And yeah, they're really trying to make it a lot easier to just add authentication to your applications.
Yeah, they provide you with a sample UI package as well. You wouldn't use it in a production app, but it certainly gives you a good kickstart. And from a learning point of view, it gives you a good idea of the scope of the features that the library offers as well. Yeah, I think I mentioned in the book that I wouldn't recommend using it because you end up having to disable a whole load of it if you don't want to be offering things like two-factor authentication and stuff. It's enabled by default as soon as you add the library in.
Yeah. So lastly, if you've written your Razor Pages app and you want to host it somewhere, is it just standard hosting or is there anything you've got to bear in mind?
It's standard ASP.NET Core hosting, so you can publish it as a framework-dependent deployment, and then so long as the target server has got the right framework on it, your application will run. It's obviously cross-platform because .NET Core is cross-platform. I host our applications on a virtual server, a virtual Windows server. And I use, I'm still old school. I'll just publish to a local folder and then FTP the replacement files. The only gotcha, I guess, when using Razor Pages or indeed MVC Core, when you want to do that, is that you have to turn your application off in order to be able to overwrite the assemblies because they get locked by the process, which you didn't used to get with the former version of ASP.NET. You just upload your files, and they did some tricky things with shadow copying in the background is how I think Microsoft described it. And they're trying to, it must be complicated, whatever they were doing, because it's taken them about 6 years to have a go at reintroducing that for .NET Core. And it's been released as experimental, I noticed, for part of .NET 6. I've tried it. It seems to work fine with one application. As soon as you add another, and then I get some issues. So I sort of just set the app offline file live on the site to stop the application, copy the files across, and then rename the app offline file to something else. It is brute force, but looking at sort of continuous integration and deployment is on my list to do. And once I actually be able to put this book to bed, I'll have I'll be able to afford the time to look at things like that.
That can be your next book.
There won't be a next book.
I bet that's what you said last time. Was it 10 years ago, did you say?
Yeah, I think in 10 years' time I'll be senile and I'll have forgotten again.
Yeah, that's one reason I really like Docker, because your deployments are completely immutable. So you're basically just spinning up a new container, then shutting down the old one, and it gets rid of all these like files that are currently in use, which, I've had that before and it's horrible. Cool. So before we move on to the book giveaway, is there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I don't think so.
Cool. Let's do a giveaway then. So as I mentioned at the start, Manning have very, very kindly offered to give away a copy of your book. And also, as I mentioned at the start, they've given us a coupon code for any of our listeners to get 35% off. And that's Pod Unhandled 21. But one of our listeners can win a copy of your book, which is quite exciting. And what I think we'll do is, if anyone that wants to be included in the prize draw tweets out about both the podcast using the hashtag #UnhandledException and also Mike's book, and then a week after publishing, I'll pick one at random, and then we'll sort that out with you. Okay, so shall we do dev tips?
Yeah, sure. My tip is don't dismiss a technology without at least giving it a go. And the reason why I said that is I see, certainly in the early days, there was quite a bit of pushback against Razor Pages. as being only suitable for simple apps, or a sort of a reversion back to the old web forms framework because of the sort of code behind approach. In fact, it isn't. It's as powerful as MVC. But when you questioned people why they had that particular thought about Razor Pages, they invariably admitted that they hadn't actually given it a go. So don't dismiss a tech without at least giving it a try.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I've seen that with all sorts of different technologies, which people, just dismiss without understanding it properly.
Don't get me wrong, I'm guilty of it myself. I have been, and then grown to regret it. And no, absolutely. You always have to have a look at something first.
So my dev tip is just a little thing I learned about the Azure DevOps pull request user interface from a colleague last week. Now, I've used Azure DevOps for quite a few years and never really noticed that the file view that lists the files on the left has got a checkbox on the left next to each file. The state of the checkbox is persisted just for you, and it's to mark the file as reviewed, which is super useful. It's like a checklist of what you've reviewed so far in that PR. And I've just checked on GitHub, and it does have a similar viewed checkbox, but it's a bit more obvious on GitHub. On Azure DevOps, it looks like one of these multi-select checkboxes to perform bulk actions. So I didn't actually realize what it was before, but I'm definitely going to start using this in PRs moving forward. So as I say, I've been using Azure DevOps for years, and I've completely missed that. So I thought it was worth pointing that one out.
Excellent.
Cool. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you if they have any questions?
Well, you can get me on Twitter at mikes.netting. That's pretty much it.
Well, I can definitely include a link to that in your in the show notes.
Yeah, I sort of have my light of it. I tend to steer clear of me public in case, I don't know.
Well, I'll include a link to your book on Manning's website. And you did give me another website earlier, which I can link to as well.
The learnrazorpages.com.
Yeah, so I'll include a link to that as well. Cool. So, well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog danclark.com has links to all my social stuff too. And we'll include links to all the stuff we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.